You just bought a new pair of Nikes. It costs you around $140. But how much did the person who made them actually earn? Over the past few decades, Nike grew into one of the most powerful sportswear companies in the world, with its products worn by elite athletes and sold across the globe. Behind this success were production systems far removed from the consumers who bought the shoes. As concerns about labor practices began to surface, Nike became the focus of growing public scrutiny. In the 1990s, reports exposed Nike's use of sweatshops in countries like Indonesia and Vietnam, revealing harsh working conditions and low wages. Although the company initially denied responsibility, widespread public pressure forced Nike to reform its labor practices and created changes that influenced corporate accountability. Before the controversy, there was the brand. Nike began in 1964 as a small startup called Blue Ribbon Sports, founded by track coach Bill Bowerman and his former student Phil Knight. Their goal was simple: create better athletic shoes and sell them to competitive runners. What started as a small operation soon grew into something much larger. During the 1970s and 1980s, Nike rose alongside the growing popularity of professional sports. Fast forward a few decades, Nike making millions of dollars and becoming a global powerhouse. But behind this success was a strategy that many corporations shared at that time: globalization. As global trade expanded, companies began moving production overseas to reduce costs and increase profits. You see, Nike didn't own factories. They never have. Instead, it outsourced production to factories overseas, primarily in Southeast Asia. Countries such as Indonesia and Vietnam offered low labor costs and fewer regulations. By outsourcing productions to these nations, Nike could exploit low wages, long working hours, and limited labor protections, allowing them to produce goods cheaply and efficiently. Nike didn't just outsource the labor, they outsourced the ethics too. Nike's revenue, millions, while the workers in their supply chains earn pennies, and the working conditions, let's just say they're less than ideal. And if you think this is where things got ugly, think again, because this is only where the story truly begins. In the early 1990s, Nike was moving at full speed. The company dominated sports culture, signing massive endorsement deals with athletes like Michael Jordan, Tiger Woods, and Serena Williams, strengthening its global presence. Nike's brand became closely tied to athletic excellence and popular culture. At the same time, production continued overseas, far from the consumers purchasing the products, and little public attention was given to the conditions under which those goods were made. That began to change when investigative reports and exposés started to reveal the harsh realities inside Nike's overseas factories. Journalists and labor activists uncovered evidence of extremely low wages, unsafe working conditions, and labor abuses. One of the most influential reports came from labor activist Jeff Ballinger. In his Harper's article, it highlights an Indonesian worker who worked for a Nike subcontractor for 14 cents an hour. That's less than Indonesia's minimum wage. And he also documented other abuses. Nike's initial response was to deny. Company officials argued that because Nike did not own the factories, it was not accountable for those conditions inside them.
About 4,000 angry workers joined in Tuesday's protest.
These revelations sparked widespread anger and criticism from consumers, activists, and the media. The company faced numerous protests, boycotts, as critics accused the company of profiting from worker exploitation. Media coverage intensified, putting Nike's labor practices under a global spotlight and raising questions about corporate responsibility in an increasingly globalized economy. As public pressure grew, Nike's carefully crafted brand image was increasingly threatened. By the late 1990s, the controversy began to affect Nike financially. The company's stock price declined, and sales growth slowed significantly as consumers' trust weakened, forcing the company to confront a crisis that it could no longer ignore. In response to the growing pressure and damage to its public image, Nike began taking steps to address the controversy. The company introduced a code of conduct for its suppliers, outlining minimum standards for wages, working hours, and workplace safety. Nike also created a corporate responsibility division and began engaging with stakeholders on labor and environmental issues, including workers' rights groups and advocacy organizations. Nike partnered with independent organizations, such as the Fair Labor Association and other monitoring groups to inspect its factories and verify compliance with its code of conduct. In 2005, Nike took a significant step by releasing a public list of its contract factories. At the time, this was a rare move, as most large corporations kept their supply chains private. By sharing this information, Nike aimed to be more transparent and allowed outside groups to watch working conditions in its factories. Alongside this push for transparency, Nike implemented a range of programs designed to improve worker well-being across the supply chain. These efforts focus on improving health and safety, providing education, and offering job training for factory workers. Nike began working with governments, industry groups, and nonprofit organizations to promote labor rights and fair working conditions. By partnering with these groups, the company tried to follow international labor standards and encourage better practices across the industry. Despite these efforts, Nike's reputation suffered serious damage. For many people, the brand became linked to sweatshops and worker exploitation. The impact of the scandal went beyond Nike itself. Public attention pushed other companies to examine their own labor practices and supply chains for potential exploitation. The Nike sweatshop scandal became a major moment in how global companies dealt with labor conditions in their supply chains. It highlighted the importance of transparency and accountability, making it harder for corporations to distance themselves from worker mistreatment. As a result, Nike was not the only company forced to change. Other global brands, including Adidas, began creating their own labor and environmental standards. Public pressure pushed these companies to monitor factories more closely and take greater responsibility for working conditions. As awareness grew, international organizations also became involved. The International Labor Organization responded by supporting programs aimed at improving labor conditions worldwide. One major effort was the Better Work Program, which focused on ensuring safer working environments, fair wages, and stronger labor protections in garment factories across multiple countries. Over the years since the scandal, corporate social responsibility has become a bigger focus in boardrooms worldwide. More companies now understand the importance of ethical supply chains. Even with these changes, the fight against sweatshop labor and worker exploitation is far from finished. Problems within global supply chains still exist, especially in regions where labor protections remain weak. It is essential that us consumers continue to play an important role by asking questions, demanding transparency, and supporting ethical brands. When public awareness grows, companies are more likely to adopt fair labor practices and take responsibility for how their products are made. Looking back on the lessons of the Nike sweatshop scandal, it becomes clear that the responsibility for creating a fair and just global supply chain is shared by all stakeholders, including multinational corporations and consumers. The Nike sweatshop controversy of the 1990s revealed how global corporations benefited from cheap labor while distancing themselves from the realities of overseas factory conditions. As reports exposed unsafe workplaces and unfair wages, public outrage forced Nike to respond, leading the company to reform its labor practices and take greater responsibility for its supply chain. This moment reflects a clear pattern of revolution, reaction, and reform, a shift in public awareness, a strong response from consumers and activists, and lasting changes in how corporations are held accountable. This topic is historically important because it acted as a wake-up call for companies around the world, emphasizing the need for ethical supply chains and the risks of neglecting social responsibility. By learning from the past and working together, businesses and consumers can build fair and sustainable supply chains
Am I a bad
for
person?
generations to come.
Tell me.